This is difficult to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. Like a son, you were trusted. Your devoted wife trusted you. Your children adored you. 7 years after wiping out his own family, Chris Watts remains alive, but he is anything but free. Each morning, he wakes behind reinforced steel doors at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He is confined not only by concrete and bars, but by the weight of his crimes and the name he now carries. Watts is closely monitored, carefully managed, and deliberately isolated, not because he is ordinary, but because he is infamous. As the years stretch on, a darker question has begun to take shape. What does life actually become for one of the most despised inmates in America? When the headlines fade and public outrage quiets, what remains? Has Chris Watts changed behind prison walls, or has time simply reshaped the punishment? For a man who murdered his pregnant wife, Shanann, and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, mercy was never expected from the justice system. In November 2018, inside a Colorado courtroom, Watts accepted a plea deal that removed the death penalty, but replaced it with something far more permanent. Life without the possibility of parole. Not once, but multiple times over. Additional decades were added for the unborn child whose life he also ended. The sentence was overwhelming in scale. But as the years passed, new details about how that sentence is lived began to emerge, details that complicate the public's understanding of punishment long after sentencing day. Is justice unfolding exactly as intended, or has time revealed a different kind of consequence altogether? Years later, the question has only grown sharper, not softer. What does this punishment actually look like in practice? How does the system manage a man it must keep alive but permanently confined? And do the newly reported details from inside his prison life reveal a form of punishment that erodes a person slowly, one day at a time, in ways few ever witness? Before the sentence, there was a life that appeared stable. Chris Watts lived in Frederick, Colorado, in a suburban home that suggested order rather than chaos. He was married to Shanann Watts, and together they were raising 2 daughters, with a 3rd child on the way. By all outward measures, the structure was complete. Workdays, family routines, and future plans shaped daily life. Nothing about his role within the household appeared remarkable. Neighbors and acquaintances did not describe volatility or instability. The family fit neatly into the expected pattern of domestic normalcy. Shanann was pregnant, and the family was preparing to grow. The future was framed around arrival, not loss. That expectation matters, because it defines the scale of what would later be destroyed. The life ahead was imagined as expanding, not fragile. This period is not important because it was exceptional, but because it was not. Its familiarity makes what followed almost impossible to comprehend. There is no need to invent warning signs or retroactively assign meaning. What matters is the contrast between appearance and outcome. A life can be organized, functional, and socially acceptable, while still containing fractures invisible until they fail. That unsettling reality forms the foundation of this case. Stability did not prevent collapse. It existed alongside it. And when the structure finally gave way, the distance between who Chris Watts appeared to be and what he became proved far greater than anyone anticipated. The unraveling began quietly, then accelerated beyond control. In August 2018, Shanann Watts and her daughters vanished from their home. At first, their absence raised concern rather than alarm. But within days, the situation shifted dramatically as law enforcement moved in. Inconsistencies emerged almost immediately. The explanations offered did not settle the growing questions. Each attempt to clarify only introduced new gaps. Timelines shifted. Details changed. What initially seemed like confusion began to look like instability. Investigators recognized that the story was not stabilizing under scrutiny, it was unraveling. Surveillance footage, digital records, and movement data all pointed back to the man who was supposed to be searching, not explaining. The more the narrative changed, the less believable it became. By August 15, uncertainty gave way to admission. Under interrogation, Chris Watts confessed. Even then, the truth did not arrive intact. Versions shifted. Responsibility moved. Early claims attempted to redirect blame, assertions investigators later rejected based on evidence. The confession did not bring immediate clarity. Instead, it exposed fractures in how responsibility was being processed. This moment marked the shift from suspicion to certainty. The investigation no longer searched for answers, it began documenting them. The evolving explanations became part of the evidence themselves. Each revision reinforced the same conclusion: the original story could not survive contact with the facts. The collapse was not sudden, it was cumulative. By the time the confession came, the truth had already forced its way through the cracks. What remained was not confusion, but confirmation. And that raises a question investigators face again and again. Why do some confessions bring clarity, while others fracture further? Why does the truth, once spoken, sometimes arrive in fragments instead of resolution? Once the facts were established, attention turned to motive, not as justification, but as context. Reporting and case summaries consistently pointed to two converging pressures: the breakdown of the marriage and an extramarital affair unfolding at the same time. These details mattered because they reframed the timeline. The murders did not occur in isolation. They followed a period marked by secrecy, emotional withdrawal, and divided loyalties. The life that appeared stable on the surface was under strain beneath it. The affair introduced an alternate future, one that competed directly with existing obligations. At the same time, the marriage was deteriorating under unresolved conflict. These factors did not cause the crime, but they shaped the environment in which rationalization took hold. Responsibility narrowed. Consequences were pushed aside. It is critical to be clear: motive explains direction, not outcome. Many marriages fail. Many people have affairs. Those realities alone do not produce violence. What distinguishes this case is the decision to resolve personal conflict through irreversible harm. Instead of accountability, the evidence shows a progression where self-interest eclipsed responsibility. The desire to escape one life and pursue another collided with the permanence of commitments already made. When that collision occurred, the choice was not to face consequences, but to eliminate what stood in the way. That is the true cost of motive when it meets action. Understanding why something happened does not soften what happened, it sharpens it. Because motive, stripped of excuse, reveals the exact moment a person chose themselves over every other life involved. So the question remains: does understanding motive ever lessen accountability, or does it only make the choice more deliberate? The legal process moved swiftly and decisively. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts entered a guilty plea to multiple counts, including first-degree murder, bringing the case to a formal close, but leaving the deeper questions very much alive. The charges included murder, the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. The plea agreement closed the door on a public trial, but it did nothing to lessen the weight of what followed. On November 19, the sentence was formally imposed. 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 3 ordered to be served consecutively. Additional decades added for the termination of the pregnancy and for tampering with the bodies. The numbers were staggering, but the meaning behind them carried even more weight. Life without parole is not symbolic. It is absolute. Inside that courtroom, time still appeared to move forward. Dates were read aloud. Records were entered. Procedures were followed. But for the person receiving that sentence, time stopped functioning in any familiar way. The future no longer offered variation or possibility. The sentence did not describe years to be completed, it defined a condition to be endured. The punishment was unmistakable in its scale. There would be no release. No reconsideration based on age, behavior, or transformation. The law did not set a distant endpoint, it erased the concept entirely. Even mathematically, the added years left no margin for hope. This was the final moment where his life unfolded in public view. After sentencing, the system no longer cared who he was or what he intended. It would only determine where he went and how long he would remain there. The courtroom marked the end of narrative choice. Yet even here, closure was incomplete. The sentence resolved the question of legal consequence, but it introduced another, one that would grow louder with time. When the gavel falls and punishment stretches indefinitely, what actually begins? Is sparing a life an act of mercy, or does it simply convert punishment into something slower, quieter, and unending? Less than a month after sentencing, the system acted again. In early December 2018, Chris Watts was quietly removed from Colorado's prison system. The decision had nothing to do with rehabilitation. It was about security. Authorities determined that keeping him in state posed an ongoing risk. His case had saturated national attention, and inside prison walls, notoriety is not abstract, it is dangerous. The transfer was administrative, procedural, and unemotional. It was not meant to soften his punishment, but to reduce the likelihood of violence. The move severed the last geographic tie to his past. Colorado was where the crimes occurred, where the investigation unfolded, and where the courtroom permanently closed its doors on his freedom. That connection was cut. Under the Interstate Corrections Compact, Watts was sent out of state, not as a privilege, but as a containment measure. The relocation mattered because it redefined how his sentence would be lived. He was no longer an inmate serving time where his history was rooted. He became a managed risk, moved like an object that needed to be placed where the system could function safely. The transfer was swift and final. There was no plan to bring him back. Wisconsin became permanent. Being removed for safety is not the same as being protected. It means control takes precedence over all else. The goal is not comfort, it is stability. His life was reorganized around that principle. New rules, new routines, new faces. People who did not know him personally, but knew exactly what he had done. This was the moment his sentence shifted from legal abstraction to logistical reality. He was no longer simply incarcerated. He was repositioned. And where he was sent would determine not just how he lived, but how much of that life would be spent alone. Does protection inside prison come at a cost worse than violence? And what happens when survival itself becomes another layer of punishment? Dodge Correctional Institution is located in Waupun, Wisconsin. Officially, it is an adult male facility operated by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. Functionally, it is a system designed to classify, contain, and manage risk at scale. The institution serves as a reception and assessment hub. Inmates arrive there to be evaluated, processed, and placed into tightly regulated structures. That function shapes every aspect of daily life. Movement is scheduled. Space is assigned. Time is measured by counts rather than clocks. Dodge's history explains its rigidity. Originally constructed in the 19th century as a hospital for the criminally insane, it evolved into a maximum security prison where control is foundational, not incidental. The architecture reflects that purpose. The routines enforce it. Days are governed by repetition. Counts occur multiple times daily to ensure every individual is accounted for. Movement between areas is limited and controlled. Recreation is structured, never spontaneous. Even basic activities unfold under supervision. Nothing happens casually. Nothing happens unseen. For someone like Chris Watts, this environment is not neutral. The institution does not adapt to the individual. The individual is reduced to what the institution can manage. Identity collapses into classification. The system does not ask who he was, it asks where he fits and how much risk he carries. This is how maximum security functions. Order is maintained not through flexibility, but through predictability. Routine becomes the primary tool of control. The same actions repeat at the same times, day after day, until they lose distinction. Variety disappears. Novelty becomes suspicious. Living inside a system built entirely around risk means surrendering autonomy completely. The prison does not need to be openly hostile to be overwhelming. Its power lies in consistency. And within that consistency, individual life shrinks. Can routine itself become punishment when it leaves no room for change? Inside Dodge, Chris Watts is not just another inmate. The nature of his crimes follows him into every controlled space. Reporting has consistently described him as deeply unpopular, isolated, and separated from the social fabric of prison life. Reputation travels faster than paperwork. Family annihilation carries a particular weight behind bars. Certain crimes place individuals at the lowest possible standing, and this case does not fade into anonymity. That status changes how others perceive him and how the institution must manage his presence. The result is separation. Not always described publicly in precise housing terms, but evident in outcome. He does not move through prison life the way most inmates do. Interaction is limited. Exposure is controlled. Fear becomes a factor in how each day is structured. This is not isolation chosen for reflection. It is isolation imposed to prevent retaliation. Safety concerns shape his environment constantly. He is kept apart because proximity itself carries risk, and the system treats that risk as permanent, not situational. Being surrounded by people while remaining socially erased creates a specific kind of pressure. He exists in shared space without shared life. There is no informal community to soften time. No alliances to dilute loneliness. Even within confinement, he is confined further. Reports suggest that much of his time is spent alone, corresponding through letters or reflecting in isolation. Physical survival is maintained, but social existence is reduced to the bare minimum required for order. He is present, but not included. Here, isolation functions as both protection and erosion. It prevents immediate harm while slowly dismantling any sense of belonging. Over time, that absence reshapes how punishment is felt. The threat is no longer only external, it becomes internal. Is safety without belonging a form of torture? And when isolation keeps someone alive, what does it quietly take away in return? At Dodge Correctional Institution, daily life is engineered around predictability. For Chris Watts, that predictability is structured through labor. His assigned role as a custodian is not about advancement or skill. It is about occupying time and ensuring the sentence continues, one controlled day at a time, in a way that keeps movement limited and behavior constantly observable. Each workday follows a narrow script. Movement is authorized, never chosen. Tasks are assigned, not discovered. Cleaning duties fill the hours, floors, restrooms, corridors, spaces that must be maintained regardless of who performs the work. The labor is repetitive by design. It stabilizes the environment as much as the individual. Work here is not about purpose or growth. It is about control. It sets firm boundaries on where he can be and when, dividing the day into manageable segments for the institution. Compliance is the value. Predictability matters more than productivity. Outside of work hours, movement remains tightly restricted. Exercise windows exist, but they are brief, scheduled, and supervised. They do not interrupt routine, they reinforce it. Every allowance is measured. Every transition is monitored. Nothing flows freely. Over time, this structure reshapes how time itself is experienced. Days are no longer remembered by events, but by checklists. One week becomes indistinguishable from the next. Variation disappears. Routine becomes the dominant sensation. This is where the psychological weight accumulates. Being useful does not mean being valued. The work offers no progress and no recognition. It only confirms that the system is operating as intended. Routine in this context does not soothe, it compresses. Existence is measured by how efficiently hours are consumed, not by how meaning is created. Eventually, the question shifts. It is no longer what comes next, but whether anything ever will. That tension sits quietly beneath the surface. When routine is all that exists, what happens when it is disrupted? Does control tighten further, or does the absence of structure expose how little autonomy was ever there? Does usefulness replace humanity in prison, or merely disguise its absence? Inside Dodge, rules define the limits of existence. When those limits are tested, the response is precise and immediate. Documented disciplinary violations illustrate how quickly the world can contract. In 2020, Chris Watts was cited for unauthorized communication and related rule breaches. The response was not dramatic, but it was consequential. Phone access was revoked. Commissary privileges were suspended. Connections that were already scarce were reduced even further, not permanently, but long enough to be felt. The following year, another infraction followed, disobeying orders and possession of unauthorized items. The result was the temporary loss of electronic privileges. Again, the punishment was measured. And again, its impact outweighed its scale. In prison, privileges are not conveniences. They are lifelines. Phone calls, commissary access, limited media. These are the few interruptions to isolation. When they are removed, the silence deepens. Discipline works incrementally. Each sanction reinforces the boundaries of control. The system does not require severity to be effective. It relies on accumulation. The message is clear. Even minor deviations will further narrow an already confined existence. What makes this structure so effective is how little freedom exists to begin with. There is no buffer to absorb loss. Each restriction presses inward, making the remaining space feel smaller. Punishment does not arrive all at once, it compounds. These violations did not alter his sentence. They did not change his status. But they reshaped how his days were lived. They served as reminders that even within life without parole, there are still depths to reach. So the question remains, is punishment cumulative, adding weight over time, or is it compounding, intensifying with every boundary crossed? In most lives, birthdays act as markers. They separate years. They invite reflection or acknowledgement. Inside Dodge Correctional Institution, those markers dissolve. For Chris Watts, birthdays pass without distinction. No special privileges. No additional recreation. No institutional acknowledgement. The day arrives and departs like any other, folded into the same schedule governing every date on the calendar. Documented reporting confirms that in 2023, and again in 2024, his birthdays passed without notice. The system does not pause. It does not commemorate. It does not adjust routine for personal milestones. Age increases. Nothing else changes. That absence matters. It reinforces the central truth of life without parole. Time moves, but it does not progress. There are no personal landmarks to soften the passage. Each year accumulates without ceremony. The effect is subtle, but powerful. When even birthdays fail to register, individuality erodes further. The person is absorbed entirely into the schedule. The calendar loses meaning beyond administration. Monotony replaces milestone. Reflection turns inward. There is no signal that a life stage has shifted, only confirmation that another year has been consumed by the same walls. That leaves a question suspended in the quiet. When time offers nothing new, what fills the void? Is being forgotten worse than being hated? Or does erasure itself become the final layer of punishment? As the years inside Dodge accumulate, another version of Chris Watts continues to circulate beyond the prison walls, not through movement or presence, but through writing. Multiple outlets have reported that he maintains correspondence with people on the outside, particularly women, using letters as his primary channel of expression. These letters matter not because of their volume, but because of their function. Writing becomes the only space where he can still shape how he is perceived. Inside prison, his identity is fixed and managed. On paper, it remains negotiable. Each letter allows him to choose language, tone, and emphasis in ways physical confinement does not permit. Reporting describes how these letters often include reflections on faith. Watts has claimed a religious transformation during incarceration, presenting himself as changed, forgiven, and spiritually reborn. These claims appear most frequently in correspondence rather than official settings. It is critical to frame this carefully. These statements are reported, not verified. They reflect how he describes himself, not how the system confirms him. Still, their existence reveals something important about identity management under permanent confinement. Faith, in this context, functions as structure. It provides language for endurance, explanation for suffering, and a framework through which he can recast himself. In letters obtained by media in 2025, he reportedly described finding peace, forgiving himself, and believing he is seen differently by God than by the world. The correspondence also reveals tension. Some letters appear to deflect responsibility or shift emotional blame. Others emphasize remorse and spiritual certainty. These variations suggest not resolution, but ongoing narrative construction. Here, the contradiction sharpens. Physically, his world is rigid and controlled. Verbally, his reach extends outward. His voice travels even as his body remains fixed. The prison restricts movement, but it cannot entirely silence expression. Letters create an imbalance. They allow selective engagement, control the tension, and responses on his terms. Yet even this expression is monitored, screened, and bounded by institutional rules. Expression exists, but never freely. Which raises a question without an easy answer. When a person without freedom can still shape a narrative, does expression become a form of power? And can repentance exist without accountability, or does language simply become another tool for survival? Among the most unsettling reported details of Chris Watts' prison life is the presence of photographs. Multiple outlets have stated that he possesses images of Shannon Watts and their daughters inside his cell. These reports sparked intense public reaction, not because of policy violations, but because of moral weight. According to reporting, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections permits inmates to possess approved photographs, subject to screening. Within policy, possession alone is not prohibited. But policy does not address meaning. The question is not whether the images are allowed, but what it signifies when a man keeps photographs of the very family he destroyed. And that question lingers far longer than any rule ever could. According to reporting, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections allows inmates to possess a limited number of approved personal photographs, provided they meet institutional guidelines. The images are screened. Content is reviewed. Within policy, possession alone is not prohibited. But policy does not account for meaning. The question raised by those photographs is not procedural, it is moral. What does it mean for a man convicted of erasing his family to keep their faces within arm's reach? Are the images symbols of remorse, tools of self-confrontation, or something else entirely? The system does not interpret intent. It only enforces rules. Meaning is left to the observer. As we bring this story to a close, it's important to remember that this case is ultimately about the lives that were lost and the lasting impact left behind. Beyond the court documents and prison sentences are real people whose absence can never be undone. True crime isn't just about understanding what happened, it's about learning to recognize warning signs, questioning appearances, and valuing accountability and empathy. These stories remind us that harm can come from places we least expect, and that awareness can matter more than we realize. Thank you for watching True Crime Confessions HD. If you found this coverage thoughtful and informative, consider subscribing and sharing responsibly. Most importantly, let's continue to approach these stories with care, respect, and a focus on the human lives affected.